teacher of literary criticism. I am Dr. Fawzi Slisli, and I will be talking to you today about Marxist literary criticism. This is our last session, so I want to introduce you to the tradition of literary criticism that developed in the Marxist school of thought. Well, we start with Karl Marx. Karl Marx initiated the tradition of Marxism in the 19th century. He was born in 1818 in Rhineland in Germany. He's known as the father of communism and the father of Marxism. In 1847 he joined the Communist Correspondence League. In 1848 he wrote the Communist Manifesto with Engels. In 1852 the League was abandoned and Marx died in 1883. Some of the most important ideas in Marxism that are relevant to literature, because we have to realize that Marx or Frederick Engels did not speak a lot about literature or about culture, but from their system of thought, from their ideas, there were also few comments, and scholars after them took those ideas and built theories of literature that became known as Marxism. The most important idea is the idea of the base and the superstructure. The base is the material conditions, and the superstructure is anything that has to do with ideas. So, for example, labor, work, economic relations, that's all part of the base. But law, education, literature, religion, all of this is part of the superstructure. So anything that has to do with ideas is part of the superstructure. Anything that has to do with the material conditions, the economic relations, is the base, is part of the base. Marx is important because before Marx, people thought that it is the ideas that people have that determines their material conditions, which means that if you are smart and educated, you have a good life and you become rich. Marx reverses that. He said it's the material conditions that determine people's consciousness, people's ideas, and people's culture. That it's the material conditions that determines how far a person can go in life. So this is very important because it's an important question for us to understand how history works. How does history work and progress? How does it move forward? The idea that history, Marx tells us that history is made out of two main forces: the base, the material conditions of life, economic relations, labor, capital, all of these material things, that's the base. And then there is the superstructure. This is what today is called ideology or consciousness, and includes ideas, religion, politics, history, education, etc. Marx said that it is people's material condition that determines their consciousness. In other words, it is people's economic conditions that determines the ideas and the ideologies that they hold. This seems pretty radical, but in a Muslim world, we have to remember that Ibn Khaldun said the same thing hundreds of years before. In the Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun says that it is the material conditions of life that determines people's consciousness. It's new. Marx's idea was new because people thought that it was your ideas that determine your material conditions. But Marx reversed it. That it is the material conditions that determine the ideas and the consciousness that people have. Let me talk a little bit now about Marxism and literary criticism. Marxist criticism analyzed literature in terms of the historical conditions which produced it. So when they look at literature, they don't just look at the content and the ideas and the characters as if they exist, you know, outside time and place and outside of history. They look at literary texts as a product of historical developments and material conditions, right? So the goal of Marxist criticism is to explain the literary works more fully, paying attention to its forms, its styles and meanings, and looking at them as products of a particular history. Marx said that Marx was important because he said that history was written behind the back of the simple person, which means that before Karl Marx, history was mostly the history of kings and big events like the battle of this and the battle of that. And so history simply meant the history of kings and the history of great events. But Karl Marx said, you know, average people are also part of history. Social life is also part of history. History is a large-scale process that includes even life in everyday communities, even the activities of poor people, even the activities of farmers, peasants. They all contribute to the development of history. So with Karl Marx, we learn to understand that history is far bigger than what we used to think it was. History is not simply the history of kings and big events, but it's also the history of average people, of life in its everyday life capacity, and so on and so forth. Also, Marxists say that the best literature should reflect the historical dialectics of its time. The best literature should reflect the historical struggles of its time. It shouldn't just exist in the clouds with no relations to the historical struggles that happened in its time. The best literature should reflect those historical struggles. To understand literature means understanding the total social process which it is part of. So for Marxism, to understand literature means understanding the social and historical process that it is part of. To understand ideology, and literature as an ideology meaning a set of ideas. Ideology is simply a set of ideas, and literature as a set of ideas is simply ideology. So to understand ideology and literature as part of ideology, one must analyze the relations between different classes in society. They also believe that literary products, novels, plays, etc., cannot be understood outside the economic conditions, class relations, and ideologies of their time. So you cannot understand a play or a novel or short story without trying to understand it in relation to the economic conditions of its time, to the class relations, to the ideologies that exist there. Truth is not eternal. They don't believe that truth is eternal. They believe that it is institutional, created by institutions. For example, the idea of private property, they say, is not a natural category. Humans didn't know the idea of private property until a certain development happened, and the idea of private property became common. Art and literature also, this is a very important Marxist idea, art and literature are commodities, meaning consumer products. Just like all other consumer products and commodities, art and literature are also consumer products. And it's a question of understanding how they work as consumer products. Art and literature, Marxism believes, art and literature are both reflections of ideological struggle and can themselves be central to the task of ideological critique. So they are they are reflections of an ideological struggle, but they can also be critiques of that ideological struggle. Historically, scholars talk of three main schools of Marxism. They say that the first school was classical Marxism. This is the Marxism of Marx, Karl Marx, and Friedrich Engels in the 19th century. Then there is the early Western Marxist tradition. This is in the 1940s, 50s. This is when Marxism became an important cultural tradition in Western Europe, in Germany and France and Italy and England and so on. And then there is late Marxism, and this is the Marxism of after the 1960s to the present. And I want to talk about each one of them briefly. Classical Marxism, criticism flourished in this period from the time of Karl Marx and Engels to the Second World War. So from Marx and Engels in the 1850s and 60s and 70s to the Second World War. This 50, 70, 60 years period is the period of classical Marxism. It insists on the following basic tenets. It insists on materialism, on economic determinism. Economic determinism, meaning that the biggest determining factor in history is the economy and economic relations. Class struggle as the most important factor in historical development. Surplus value, reification, proletarian revolution, and communism as the main force of historical development. Basically, in this early period, Karl Marx tells us, follow the money. If you want to understand how history works, follow the money. Ask the question, who benefits? Who benefits economically? If you want to understand society, follow the money. Who benefits economically? And that would explain the historical processes to you. Marx and Engels were political philosophers. They were not literary critics. The few comments they made on literature enabled people after them to build a Marxist theory of literature. So they didn't have a theory of literature themselves, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. But the few comments they made about literature allowed other people, other scholars later on, to develop what became known as the Marxist theory of literature. Marx and Engels were more concerned with the content rather than the form of literature. They didn't pay attention to the form. They mostly paid attention to the content of literature. Because to them, literary study was more politically oriented and content was much more politically important. They were interested in the political function of literature, the political function of novels and plays and short stories. And in that sense, they didn't pay much attention to the form of literature. They only paid attention to the content of literature. Literary form, however, did have a place if it served their political purpose. Marx and Engels, for instance, liked the realism of Charles Dickens, of Honoré de Balzac, of W.M. Thackeray, and Lenin, the first ruler, the first leader of the Soviet Union, praised Tolstoy for the political and social truths of his novel. So this is the period of classical Marxism. It includes Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, the leaders of the Soviet Union, and the theorists and political writers of this period from the 1880s, if you want, until the Second World War. Early Western Marxism, well, the biggest name here is George Lukács. George Lukács was perhaps the first Western Marxist. George Lukács denounced the mechanistic and vulgar Marxism that people were practicing at his time in the 40s and 50s and so on. that the features of a cultural text, he said, were strictly determined by or interpreted in terms of the economic and social conditions of its production and by the class status of its author. Basically, he criticized traditional Marxism. He said, you guys are concentrating too much on the economy, that you're failing to see how other things can be seen as material conditions. What constitutes material condition? Does it have to be something material that you can hold, or some other things that are less material in their appearance can constitute a material condition? So he criticized traditional Marxism, but he insisted more than anybody else on the traditional Marxist reflectionist theory, that basically that literature is a reflection. Literature is part of the superstructure, and the superstructure reflects the base. He insisted on this more than anyone else. Even when this theory of reflection, superstructure reflects the base, even when this theory was under severe attack from the formalists, the Russian formalists in the 50s, George Lukács defended it. Another important name in Western Marxism is Mikhail Bakhtin. He comes from the Russian formalist school, but Bakhtin had to run away from Russia and died in the process, and his books were not translated until the 1960s. And his most important book is Discourse and the Novel, written in the 1930s. Bakhtin, like George Lukács, tried to define the novel as a literary form in terms of Marxism. He tried to say that basically the novel is the most Marxist form that can serve the struggle of workers, the struggle of peasants, the struggle of poor people against capitalism. The discourse of the novel, he says, is dialogical, which means that it is not tyrannical, it's not one-directional, it allows dialogue. Bakhtin makes a distinction between dialogical and monological. He says monological discourse is one-directional. Dialogical discourse is based on dialogue. Monological discourse is tyrannical. It doesn't allow for dialogue. And dialogical discourse is more open and allows for dialogue and participation. He says the novel is dialogical. Poetry is monological, one-directional, and tyrannical. Another one of his important books is Rabelais and His World. He explains in this book that laughter and play, right? He studies the festivals of laughter of the medieval period in Europe, and he says that laughter in the medieval carnival represented the voice of the people as an opposition, as an oppositional discourse against the monological, serious ecclesiastical church establishment. Also part of the early Western Marxism, we should also cite the Frankfurt School of Marxism. It was founded in 1923 at the Institute of Social Research in the University of Frankfurt in Germany. Members and adherents have included Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Walter Benjamin, Erich Fromm, and Herbert Marcuse, Louis Althusser, Raymond Williams, and others. A distinctive feature of the Frankfurt School is independence of thought. They have proved to be independent in terms of their thought. They have shown themselves to be interdisciplinary. They use multiplicity of disciplines, and they have also proved to be open to opposing views. So although they are Marxist, they're not rigid in their Marxism. They are open to borrowing ideas from other traditions. The third phase, called late Marxism, and it is often associated with the writing of Frederick Jameson in the United States, or Raymond Williams in England, Ijaz Ahmad in India, or the work of Louis Althusser in France. Raymond Williams says there were at least 3 forms of Marxism: the writings of Karl Marx, the system developed by later Marxism out of these writings, and Marxism popular at given historical moments. That's Raymond Williams. Frederick Jameson says there were 2 Marxism, one being the Marxian system developed by Karl Marx himself, and the other being its late development of various kinds. And this brings me to the end of this lecture. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this course, and I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I hope to see you in other lectures. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.